And now, a passage from Midwest at Noon, from Chapter 4, The City's Rise. Chicago is the metropolis of the West. To describe this great city, now the fourth largest in the world, defies one's powers. Abler pens than mine have done it, and yet Chicago changes so fast that their written descriptions are largely out of date, or out of truth in a few years. Here is a city of nearly 4 million souls with another 2 millions in satellite communities round it, composed of almost all Caucasian nationalities, Negroes and Orientals, and dependent on agriculture, mining, oil, electricity, the seaborne traffic of the Great Lakes or the canals and rivers, and the most intricate texture of railroads and highways on Earth. The most impressive first sight of the New World is when you sail into New York Harbor, if it is on a clear day. But the most impressive first sight of the Midwest is when you fly into Chicago at night from the east, descending over the blackness of the prairie to the great ruddy blast furnaces and steel mills, catching the first winkings of the Lindbergh beacon from the Palmolive building away on the starboard bow, and watching the brilliant rectangles formed by 1,000 square miles of straight streets and buildings. Huge, sprawling city of swamp and prairie, one community of many communities, communitas communitatum. It is both a Pittsburgh and a Detroit, a financial and commercial center, a warehouse, department store, mail-order house, granary, slaughterhouse, and inland seaport, a repository of great wealth and great poverty, a center of learning, metropolis of that 1,000,000 square miles which is the heart of America. It is something of a national metropolis, too, because of its position. It is the national headquarters of the medical, surgical, and hospital associations, of Rotary and other service clubs, of America's library associations, of the mail-order business, of the musical and jukebox industry, which plays so large a part in American life, of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and of the cinematograph equipment trades. It is a part of all American life. Driving into the city from the airport up Archer Avenue, you could be on the outskirts of Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, Bucharest, or almost any other big Central or Eastern European city except Berlin or Vienna, which have too many apartment blocks. And in a sense you are, for the names above the stores and on the windows of offices speak all European tongues. Little clapboard houses with unfenced patches of garden remind you of a dozen European nations and their cities. Miles and miles of streets go by, with rail yards and warehouses, corner stalls and markets, before you see the strange billowing vastness of the inland sea, the great cluster of skyscrapers and the biggest hotels in the world that sprout inside the central loop of the elevated lines, like precocious, overgrown plants in a wired-in forcing bed, and perhaps the noblest front that any city in the world ever deliberately put on, Michigan Avenue. This great and imposing front was once washed by the waves of Lake Michigan. Then the Illinois Central tracks came along it on piles and wooden bridges. Then the sandy foreshore was drained and reclaimed for the Columbian Exposition in 1892-93. The work was extended, and today Michigan Avenue is mainly built up on the western side, facing east across the lake and looking down on reclaimed and man-made Grant Park, the open-air theater, the Greek buildings of the Chicago Museum of Natural History, the Old Field Museum, Soldier Field, like a Byzantine hippodrome, the elegant Shedd Aquarium and Adler Planetarium, the richly endowed Art Institute, and the imaginative superhighway of the Outer Drive, which takes traffic along the lakefront from north to south, away from the loop for 20 miles. Driving along that highway by day or night, and looking across to Michigan Avenue, the loop behind it, and the big buildings of the near north side, you marvel at this noble city of the prairie on a seashore, where the first skyscraper was born. Just parallel with the northern boundary of the loop, you cross the Chicago River, by the bridge which President Franklin D. Roosevelt opened with his famous Quarantine the Aggressors speech in October of 1937. Just here is an example of Chicago's ingenuity, initiative, and enterprise. The sluggish Chicago River, on the swampy banks of which the first white fur trader settled 150 years ago, and Fort Dearborn was put up, used to meander through sandbars and reeds into Lake Michigan. Chicago straightened it, put a lock and a harbor at its new mouth, and now the river can either flow into the lake, and so into the Atlantic, by way of the St. Lawrence or admit vessels and water from the lakes, channel them round the loop and down the canal to the Illinois River, and so to the Gulf by way of the Mississippi. One canal, a few locks, and Chicago became a two-way lake port. Another side to the story is not so impressive. The cities downstream enjoy the trade and traffic, but they do not like the products of the city's effluents, which wash downstream when the locks are opened, and the higher level of the lake water puts a head on the canal and the streams. This is the cause of a long and acrimonious dispute between Chicago, the adjoining states, the cities on the rivers, their various legislatures or authorities, and the National Congress and Supreme Court. All of these authorities are involved in Chicago's struggle for better sanitation and drinking water, it comes from the lake, and in her neighbors' struggles to avoid inheriting Chicago's dirt, while Chicago gets clean. The fourth city of the world, built by fools on piles in a marsh at the southern end of a lake, has other problems too, which grew with its size, impressiveness, and beauty. Life in all American cities is more varied, mobile, and hectic than in any others in the world, but in none is it more so than in Chicago. Chicago has the best human virtues and the worst vices. It is therefore more truly human than any city, and it tells more about humanity. It tells it frankly, honestly, and openly. Nothing is hidden, nothing hushed. The beauty of Michigan Avenue is offset within 5 or 10 minutes walk westward by the derelict buildings, dirty alleys, and run-down, overcrowded dwellings that any other city would hide or gloss over. Not so Chicago. Look on this picture and now on that, and see what was done and remains to be done. That seems to be the motto of Chicago. It has more extremes and variety than Istanbul, Singapore, or Shanghai, and 10 or 100 times their vigor. The vigor and vitality of the city amaze the visitor. Like an anthill, it is always moving day and night. Other cities have their quiet times, not so Chicago. To find a blasé Chicagoan would almost be a relief. So keen, so hungry and thirsty for new experiences, so curious, so divinely discontented and unsatisfied are Chicagoans of all income brackets and national origins. That is why Chicago holds the quintessence of the Midwest. In Chicago, all the extremes and extremisms of the region reach a grand climax. Within a minute or two's walk of the splendid stores and hotels and offices in the Loop, you pass the flop houses of West Madison, Canal, and North Clark Streets, the hiring offices for casual railroad laborers, good eats provided, painted white, on the windows, the terrible slums in Negro District near the stockyards, the wastelands near the rail yards, the hangouts of the bums, and especially of the old, wrinkled, slow-moving, pathetic bums. I think bums and bumming around are still used more frequently in the Midwest than anywhere else because of the size of the region. The importance of its vast railroad network, the building of that network, and its maintenance. It is natural, in the region of the greatest mobility in America, that the Germans' Bummeln should have thus passed into the general slang. On railroad maintenance, in thousands of factories, in the stockyards, and down south in the steel mills work the sons of 50 nations, all Americans, all Midwesterners, all Chicagoans. And if white and colored, Sicilian and Greek, German and Pole occasionally clash, what of it? It is natural, the naturalness of so many different kinds of human nature. A little bloodletting is a small price to pay for such general tranquility and order. The police are tolerant and extremely tactful, for they are mainly of Irish, but also of German, Polish, Czech, and other national origins. Chicago is a League of Nations, a United Nations in itself. But it has been learning for 75 years how to live and let live, when to pay out the line and when to reel it in, when to give ground and when to hit hard. It requires a good deal of management and skill to give such a city order and regularity. As with so much in the Midwest, the wonder is that it has so much order, efficiency, and regularity. You cannot achieve that quickly without some show of toughness and force. You cannot let intolerance abolish order. And yet, you must preserve liberty. Who are the Chicagoans? More than New Yorkers, Jersey citizens, Philadelphians, Pittsburghers, Clevelanders, Detroiters, St. Louisans, New Orleanais, or San Franciscans. They come from almost every race and people. There are Americans from all regions. Germans form solid districts all over, but chiefly in the north and northwest, like the working-class quarters of Hamburg. Poles, with their pseudo-Baroque Catholic churches with green cupolas, make whole areas look like Krakow or Lodz. Czechs and Slovaks keep their homes and little gardens more neatly and reproduce Brunn or Pilsen, Brno or Pilsen in the Midwest. Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians have their homes out in the southwest, looking severe and North European in winter. There are Scandinavians of all kinds, Italians of all kinds too, who keep their feast days and market days as if in the old country and live in solid blocks of the city. Greeks, Yugoslavs, and Syrians mainly on the west side, Mexicans, Chinese, and Japanese in their characteristic quarters, Hungarians down in the south, and also on the north side mixed in with the Czechs and Germans and Yugoslavs, whom in Europe they dislike. British, Dutch, Belgians, Spaniards, Portuguese, Russians, Ukrainians, and Armenians, and of course, the Negroes. It was estimated in 1940 that 2/5, nearly 1/2, of adult Chicagoans did not generally speak English, or as Illinois puts it, American, in their own homes. Nearly all of them can speak it, and do outside, or with their American children. But there are many Chicagoans over the age of 50 who cannot speak it at all. They live in one or other of these compact groupings and do not need to. No wonder there are so many confusing accents in Chicago. New Yorkers and other Americans can make fun at the Brooklyn or Italian accent because in New York they stand out firm and clear. No one in Chicago makes fun of any particular accent because there is no single Chicago accent as a standard from which to deviate. There are so many. Chicagoans of German, Italian, Polish, and Czech national origin of the first or second generation with their children accounted in 1940 for more than 1/3 of the people. The others of non-English speaking origin and the Negroes brought that proportion to more than 1/2, a clear majority. Here is a potent source of variety and difference as well as of vigor and restlessness. The same pattern can be traced with less degree of clarity and intensity in almost every Midwest city and large town. Americans from outside the Midwest tend to think of Chicago as Sandburg's hog butcher to the world, as being composed of vast stockyards and slaughterhouses, everything used but the squeal, surrounded by some fairly decent apartment blocks and some necessary hotels and offices in a downtown section called the Loop, or the North Side, and peopled by a scared race who go to and from work under a periodic hail of gangsters' lead. Nothing could be more grotesquely inaccurate. The stockyards are vast, surprisingly trim and clean, and localized in a compact area away from the main thoroughfares and traffic, except, of course, the huge rail yards which serve them. You can live in Chicago for years and not know that meatpacking goes on there. Chicago is not the only American city with gangsters, but in Chicago the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. They, too, keep to their local haunts, taverns, and night spots. They have a rigid code. The penalty for failure to observe it is quicker and more severe than in normal so-called civil society. The only Chicagoans who see a gangster or hear his shots are those who, out of an inverted sense of snobbery or curiosity, go to the gangsters' haunts to see them, or more rarely, happen to be about in the small hours when the code of gangland is enforced. Even then, the gangsters take remarkable care not to shoot up the public. Everything is nicely and neatly arranged so that only the principals, gangsters, and police are directly affected. Crime, racketeering, robbery with violence, other forms of lawlessness, these are more in evidence, as in other big American cities, and on them we shall have more to say later. But the activities and deaths of gangsters are known to Chicagoans in the same way as they are known to all other Americans, namely in the columns of the newspapers. The visitor generally sees only the Loop, the outer drive, the near north side, the offices and hotels, and perhaps one or two institutions on the outskirts, factories, mail-order houses, universities, hospitals. He seldom sees the Chicagoans at home. Their homes are their pride, and rightly so. From over 30 miles north of the Loop to 30 miles west and southwest, or 15 miles south, and from as near as only 3 miles. The commuters come into the Loop by steam and electric trains, trolley cars, buses, and automobiles. They are very early risers. Chicago starts work at the same hour as New York, where time is an hour later and often before it. All factories and most Loop offices are working by 8 or 8:30. From 6:30 in the morning until 8:30, the commuters go into town, and from 4:30 in the afternoon until 6:30, they go out again. They have little time for lunch. Half an hour is quite common. They are a hard-working community. Their homes are the places where they relax. The variety of suburbs is bewildering. In this respect, Chicago is far less standardized than most other American cities. The styles of architecture, layout of the suburb, and density of population per acre vary from the spacious, quiet beauty of Glen Ellen, Hinsdale, Winnetka, Riverside, Evanston, and Highland Park, to the greater uniformity and compactness of Oak Park, Rogers Park, and the South Side, with its more frequent apartment blocks, and then to the still more densely settled communities nearer the Loop. No greater luxury, spaciousness, elegance, and beauty could be found than in the old homes and modern apartments of the wealthy on the near North Side, the Gold Coast, or the great homes and estates of Lake Forest, Wheaton, or Barrington. Farther out, too, beyond the 30-mile limit, are the big estates, summer homes, farms, or weekend cabins of many of the better-off Chicagoans. But the homes of the great majority of Chicagoans, of the German workers, of the nearer Northwest Side, and of those of all national origins in separate wood frame or brick and clapboard houses, or in brick, stone, and concrete apartment blocks, are homes indeed. For 10 miles around, the terrible grime of the soft coal from the many rail yards blackens the windows and the outside, and the drapes or curtains inside. But the interiors are generally kept clean, full of those intimate belongings and that informal atmosphere which make a place home. Chicago is not mainly an apartment city, like most of New York, nor does it live and eat in public places. It is a city of separate homes, to which the visitor or client is immediately made welcome. It is a city of home-proud, city-proud citizens whose fathers and grandfathers came there to make a home, and made both a home and a city. And in that it is typically Midwestern. It is the product of the South, New England, and Central Europe. It is even more of a cosmopolitan city than New York. This has one interesting byproduct. Chicago has little of its own to offer the mere visitor or tourist. It is not a center of entertainment or diversion like New York or Los Angeles, or a national historical center like Boston or Philadelphia, or an old and quaint city of non-American origins like New Orleans or San Francisco. There are beautiful things to see in Chicago, but few tourists want to go to the remarkable Art Institute or the wonderful museums. Children and students flock to them. Few businessmen go, and the life of the Midwest is business. They want relaxation or fun. The fun of the Rush Street or North Clark Street night spots and other such places, many run by questionable persons, is ordinary, vulgar, and raw. For those reasons, these places are well patronized, but not regularly by Chicagoans. The theaters are average, and despite or perhaps because of Mr. Sam Insull's colossal barn of an opera house, with its indifferent acoustics, Chicago has no permanent opera, and for an adequate performance has to depend on New York. The smaller and more congenial Orchestra Hall, hallowed with memories of Thomas and Stock, provides music and a home for a good symphony orchestra. The movie houses are vast, numerous, comfortable, and always full day and night. The big hotels put on the best entertainment in Chicago. But because there is so much to see and do on the street, and because, as in the early days, taverns and night spots are extraordinarily numerous, the visitor for a few days and nights gets the impression that there is much liquor, fun, relaxation, and diversion in Chicago, and that Chicagoans are always indulging in them. Again, that is grotesquely inaccurate. Chicagoans will put themselves to no end of trouble and expense to take a visitor or client round the night spots, the floor shows, to the theater, or on a round of a few of the many taverns. But that is not how the Chicagoan lives when the visitor has departed. The Chicagoan is like the Parisian in this respect, a very devoted home lover. Judged by visitors who hardly ever see him at or inside his home, he is judged by what he provides for alien palates. For this, the Chicagoans are not responsible, though America may be. Much of the less attractive, noisy, blatant, neon-signed, liquor-smelling aspect of Chicago is therefore the millions of visitors, businessmen, and passers-by who have to traverse this vast crossroads city between transcontinental or other trains. The greatest railroad hub in the world still has no central terminal, no through connection for passengers. You have to change stations, to the perpetual profit of the men who own taxis and hotels. True, many of the 20% of Chicagoans who live in mean streets and poor housing areas and work very hard at the rougher jobs regularly patronize the taverns, as the small minority of unimaginative and unwise businessmen, condemned by their fellows as unreliable or unstable, regularly patronize the places on Rush Street and elsewhere. That is because both these groups lack imagination, have poorly stocked minds, and have not acquired or been able to acquire any other ideas of relaxation. That occurs with the same groups in every big city. Drowning one's sorrows or giving them bromide is not unique to Chicago, nor are the sorrows of humanity. But the vast majority of Chicagoans lead quiet, domestic lives in their own homes and with their neighbors who are friends. If you enjoy the content being produced here on High Americana, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon, which is linked below in the description. Thank you very much.